Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and another new week. And a week of, again, but last week we were doing catch-up shows. This week it's kind of random ones that don't really fit into another subject. Although the two today do cover in some ways the same thing. Reminding you what is coming up later. Mary Louise Roberts is coming on talking about her brilliant book, Sheer Misery, about the experience of the Allied soldier in the ETO, from frostbite and fatigue to worrying about being killed. But now, kind of starting with the history of the British Army, we're talking about Browned Off and Bloody Minded, the first book, and so far my favorite of Alan Allport's books. He's been on the channel 2 or 3 times before. If you're new to World War II TV, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to click the links below to get everything you need, with links to my guests' books and social media contacts, etc., etc. Without further ado, I'm going to bring in Alan Allport over in Syracuse. So good morning to you, but afternoon to me. How are you today, Alan?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well indeed.
So your book was kind of an examination of just the whole culture and the social history of the British Army, as well as being a military history. And one of the things I think we discussed on the first show in the clunky early days of World War II TV is do you think that it's easier to get a lens about your own nation when you don't live in your own nation? I've been out of England for 20 years. You've been out of England for a similar time now. So do you think that affords you the benefit of seeing your own nation through the experiences of other people?
Yeah, it's a bit strange being an expat for this long now. It's been 30 odd years. I left Britain when John Major was still Prime Minister. Tony Blair was still a twinkle practically in his father's eye. So things have changed a lot. You get a different perspective, I think. And it's partly about living away. I mean, it also helps that in a way that I teach predominantly American undergraduates, and I actually don't teach a great deal of British history anymore for a number of different reasons. I spend far more of my time now teaching American military history, which has been enlightening in lots of ways, because it's provided a kind of comparative structure for the research that I do. It also helps, I think, that when I do touch on British history, obviously it does come up, British military history in particular, the undergraduates who have come to the subject from a completely different point of view to me often ask questions which are that I wouldn't ask, because I'm too immersed in the culture. I know, in some ways, I know too much about the subject to ask the right questions a lot of the time. And so, they will often sort of approach you and say things like, this is really weird. The way that this operates is really strange, and it hadn't occurred to you up to this point how really weird it is. There are lots of things about Britain that are deeply weird that it doesn't, it's not clear to you until somebody actually points it out, and they say, yeah, you're absolutely right. This is very strange, and they don't do it like this in the rest of the world at all. So it's a bit of the sort of mixture of, it's a bit like, autobiography versus biography. It provides that kind of interesting combination of speaking from within, but also having a view from the outside as well.
Super answer. But I mean, the thing about the British Tommy of World War II, the British soldier, is that people of our age group and up, we all knew old soldiers, my granddad, my great uncle, but the younger generation who haven't necessarily met that generation, their understanding of who those guys are from things like the John Mills Dunkirk films and Wooden Horse, and there's those movie versions and comic versions which have some semblance of reality, because they're often written by people who are in the service themselves. But also the mythical British Tommy has also become, like we talked about the myth of the Battle of Britain last time, there's a quality about that character that perhaps isn't quite right, because it's all created from comics and movies. But you've come with your PowerPoint, and we're going to go through 10 points about the British soldier from your book, and so you'll maybe tell me when to move on the slides. And folks, if you've got questions for Alan about training and the British Army and how it ran and traditions, then we'll do that as we go along. But we're essentially talking about the transition from a kind of peacetime army moving out of the First World War to the professional army, in quotes, that eventually was victorious in World War II. So over to you, Alan.
Okay. Well, do you want to? Let's bring up the first one then, which is these are sort of my talking points for the day. And so the first point I wanted to make was that obviously, Britain had done this before. In 1939, this was not an entirely blank slate, because, of course, from 1914 to 1918, it had also raised this extraordinary mass citizen army. And the experience, both good, bad, and otherwise, about that, it always influences the decisions and the attitudes of the Second World War. I mean, of course, the biggest thing of all is both the extent of the size of the army of World War One, and also its casualty rate. The British Army, unlike the British Army of World War II, the British Army of World War One was engaged almost from the first day to the last against the main body of the enemy, against the German army, which it isn't arguably for at any point really, except perhaps for a few weeks in World War II in 1940, and so it suffers commensurately greater casualties, greater fatalities. Now, obviously, there is we won't even get into the vast amounts of literature and historiography that there is about the British Army in the First World War and its learning curves and all the rest of it. But I think whatever historians would say today about its performance, there is no question that by the 1930s, at least the myth that the army had, suffered both disproportionately and unnecessarily kind of hangs over things. And so there is both a fear about repeating that experience, about vast swathes of dead emerging from new Passchendaels and new Somme. I think it also hangs over the leadership as well. I think, obviously the political leadership, the fear that the country will not stand another similar sanguine experience is definitely has an influence upon military decisions. I also think it influences the officer class too, from all the way from the most junior subalterns all the way up to the highest ranks. I mean, you've got Al Murray's coming on in a couple of days talking about command, and it will be interesting to see what he and his new book have to say about this. But I think one of the things that always struck me is the way that generals like Montgomery, who had of course been a subaltern and a captain in the early days of World War One, he obviously had much of his ideas about leadership and command had been shaped by the impression that he had received as a junior officer, that the general staff of his own army in World War One had been callously indifferent, detached from the events that were actually going on in the field. And I do think that has something to do with the way in which the generals of World War II very much want to be seen as leading from the front, that they're not these chateau generals who behind the rear lines reading the casualty reports. So everyone has this in mind. Everyone has in mind both the lessons which they believe that they have learned from the First World War and the things that they want to sort of try and emulate, and also to avoid. I mean, just one last thing before we move on about this. I always think that it hangs over a lot of the audience too. The belief, which I think is a quite erroneous belief, but it's a common one, that their fathers who had fought in the First World War had been tougher than they were. This comes up a lot. This feeling that the experience of being in World War One had been more difficult than World War II, and that the generation that had preceded them had been able to stick it out better and been able to endure this better. There's a sort of inferiority complex that runs through the British Army in World War II. Now, it's ironically, if you look at the experience, if you experience of the Second Army in Normandy in 1944, I mean, it's arguable that it's actually a worse experience, than the Army of the Somme or the Army of Passchendaele in terms of casualty rates and so on. But the myth is what really preoccupies people, and this fear that that they're not really as good as their dads had been. It comes up quite a lot.
Good. And I thought we also have that point as well, that the technology that had finished the end of the First World War with aviation and things like that, and massed artillery and tanks and things, was kind of going to be the new way of winning wars. And yet as we know, 20s and 30s, there were difficulties of another nature and financial and depressions and things that the army and the military generally didn't have the resources to put into practice the lessons that had been learned. But which moves us to our next point, which is the fundamental lack of preparedness.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the principal lesson, which apparently had been learned, was not to do this again. This was something that was believed both again by the political class and also for a very large number of senior officers too, that this was an experience which had been, First World War had been a kind of abhorrent or at least a highly unusual experience that should not be repeated again. The British Army should never be engaged in large numbers, raised as a mass army and fight on the continent of Europe ever again. It would be unnecessary to do it because the technology now meant that future wars would be fought predominantly by strategic bombing aircraft, and also that and it shouldn't be done because the country could not stand such a loss of life again. So the army is very much relegated in the 1920s and for most of the 1930s to very much the Cinderella service of the three armed services. For much of the period, the Navy is still the predominant force. And then by the time you get to about 1934, 1935, and you start serious rearmament is almost entirely devoted to, first of all, to the RAF, and the idea that this is now the principal spearhead, the striking force of the nation, and to a slightly lesser degree to the Navy. The idea, to a very astonishingly late date, I mean, really, right to the end of 1938, so after the Munich crisis, the idea is still that the British Army, if war breaks out in Europe, the British Army's role will essentially be one of manning anti-aircraft guns, guarding airfields, and defending the empire, and at most possibly going off to fight Mussolini in Egypt, and that's about it. But the idea of the field force, as it was called, a new expeditionary force to France, was just regarded as a total non-starter, and it was made very clear by the Baldwin and Chamberlain governments that this was not going to happen. Now we haven't got time to go into exactly why that changed so drastically, but by the midpoint of 1939, that has had a 180-degree reverse. And in fact, the government has committed itself to building initially a 32-division Imperial Army. Eventually, it's supposed to be a 52-division Imperial Army. So not all that much smaller than the army of World War I. The Territorial Army has been doubled in size. The conscription has been introduced in the spring of 1939 as a preliminary to full wartime conscription. And the army is suddenly told, after 20 years of being told, you are never going to do this again, it's been told, well, actually, you have to do this again, and you have to do this almost immediately. And a big part of why there are an enormous amount of problems in the early years of the war is simply this need suddenly to scramble to try and perform services that it is assumed would never take place again. In the short term, it's a disaster for the British Army because, of course, if you suddenly decide to double the number of territorial army divisions, for instance, that suddenly means that half of all of your officers and senior and experienced NCOs have to be hived off from every single existing division in order to go and be a cadre to create these new ones. There's no way that this isn't going to cause enormous amounts of disruption. So we talk a lot about the way in which the army that goes to France in 1939 is super modern and sort of the most motorized army in the world and so on, and that's fair, and there's a lot of important things to say about that, but it's also tremendously underprepared. And one of the things that strikes contemporaries at the time is just how little actual experience of soldiering there is, amongst so many of the troops that go out there.
I mean, I think one of the things my takeaways from your book, which I've read twice, I read my paperback and then I got myself a hardback and read that.
Oh, you're a glutton for punishment, aren't you?
Yeah, with that idea that the regular battalions of most of the British regiments were overseas protecting, as you say, the empire. So they were the professional soldiers, but professional soldiers for an entirely different type of combat, overseas policing, really. So all the units that had 1st Battalion in places like Singapore and Palestine and Malta and everyone else, they're highly professional, but highly professional, almost border guards.
They're an Imperial constabulary. That's how I described them in the book. They're trained for a different purpose. They're equipped for a different purpose. One of the many, the discussion about, tanks and tank development in the 1930s is obviously there's a whole series of podcasts you could do about that alone. But I mean, one of the things which I think is often overlooked is the fact that if your job essentially is to act as a kind of security force for a tropical empire, there is no point in having tanks. What on earth are you going to do with them? You can't use them for crowd control. You can't use them for guarding small islands in the Pacific Ocean or anything like that. So it made complete sense that the army neglected a lot of the kind of things that it would need for continental warfare. And then suddenly finds out in 1939, well, actually, you've got to fight. You've got to fight the main body of the German army again in Belgium and northern France. So it turns out that spending the last 20 years working on tank warfare actually would have been a good idea. But we
all
can't,
the things that they didn't do.
Right. That ship has sailed. So you've got to scramble to do what you can do.
Which brings us to the point number 3. The army that went to France in 1939 never really had a chance to fight. And that is something. Well, again, one of the things I liked about your book is it told me things that I realized I did know, but hadn't actually articulated the thought properly. And it's like, that reinforces some of the things that my brain had been spinning around, but you just managed to sort of put it down there and make sense of it. So explain more about what you mean.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of self-explanatory, really. But I mean, the great sort of anticlimax in some ways of the sending of this BEF to France in September 1939, of course, is that when the day actually comes, it only spends a matter of weeks, really, in engagement with the German army. Most of the reason why the army never really gets to fight properly, of course, is outside of its hands. It's always the junior force on the Allied side. The French army is by far the larger, and it is on the French front that the most critical events take place. Of course, the breakthrough at Sedan and the sickle sweep through northern France and so on. I mean, I think it's an interesting, it's a fascinating campaign to read about. You get glimpses of how effective, in theory, it's one of the great what might have been, counterfactuals, which I love, even if other people don't. What would have happened if, the Guderian hadn't broken through at Sedan, they hadn't crossed the Meuse, and instead the war had settled down to a much more conventional kind of struggle that, that resembled a lot more World War I. I mean, one thing, of course, is the casualty rate would have been huge again, and so that would have left a very mixed legacy. Now, how well would the army of 1939 and 1940 have actually performed if it had to fight properly? There's some evidence that it might have done very well. You get glimpses of this, for instance, in terms of Montgomery, who's in command of 3rd Infantry Division in 1940, conducts a magnificent fighting withdrawal on the northern flank during the most desperate days of the war. It's a testimony to the extreme professionalism of this regular army. I mean, that's the thing. The army, of course, in May 1940 is almost entirely made up of both regulars and reservists and some territorials. But there are hardly anybody who's been conscripted or has volunteered since the war breaks out actually fights in France in May 1940. They're all still back in training camps. You do get some great glimpses of that. You also get some signs that there were a number of things which, a certain sclerosis had definitely set in the army in the years between the wars. There are some serious problems with communications and signals, with intelligence gathering, with some of the organization of command. Famously, of course, cooperation with the RAF is extremely poor during the campaign. Kit is uneven, I think, is probably a fair way to describe it. Some very good kit combined with some extremely inadequate kit, and also just the lack again of preparation for commanding large formations in such a war. You know, it had been practically impossible to conduct, you know, divisional, let alone corps or army sized exercises between the war, because the army was so small and almost all of it was in India anyway. So, you know, it is, you know, the performance of individual commanders is very uneven. Some of them do extremely well, some of them do rather poorly. But in some ways, all of this, of course, is a moot point, because that army is wrecked in terms of, you know, it has to abandon most of its equipment, and although most of the troops escape, it will never fight in that composition ever again once it escapes from Dunkirk. The army that emerges post Dunkirk is in many ways a completely reconceived kind of army. There you go, which sort of takes.
And this is the revolution, isn't it? This is the changing of a professional army that wasn't necessarily suited to the strenuous I can't get my words out, the ordeals of World War II, to a modern army that is set up to deal with that type of combat. So the turning of civilians into military, which is fascinating.
So, I mean, one of the big consequences of Dunkirk is that conscription into the army, which up till that point had actually been conducted in a rather laggardly way, the Chamberlain government had not been in any great hurry to get men into the army. Oh, thank you, James. Partly, I think, because it still thought that aerial warfare was going to be the predominant way in which this war was going to be fought. I think also, you know, Chamberlain was also clinging to the hope that maybe there would be some kind of political breakthrough in the war before the main armies engaged, and so it would still be possible to kind of bring this thing to an end before any massive battles take place. But all of that, of course, comes to a close with Dunkirk. And so one of the second half of 1940, there is massive recruitment into the army. If you are going to fight if you're going to be a soldier in the British Army in World War II, very, very likely you enter it in the second half of 1940. That's by far the largest period of recruitment. You know, once you get into 1941, 1942, the manpower pool starts to dry up a bit, so it's less likely. And it is, as I described it in the book, it's an army of shopkeepers. It is an army which is almost entirely now made up of young men who never expected to fight, to be soldiers. They never expected to have to fight in another war, certainly as in the British Army. Never particularly wanted to be, and have no real idea, no real kind of acculturation into what being a soldier is going to be about, you know, other than what they've picked up from their fathers or possibly their uncles or maybe even their older brothers from the experience of World War I. I have a little breakdown in the book, and I picked up a few numbers. So there is some fantastic data from a bit later in the war, from 1944, about what the composition of the army is in terms of what people had done pre-war, you know, before they became soldiers. And it's fascinating to read it. It tells you something about British society in the 1930s and what sort of people did, you know. But for instance, so of the other ranks in 1944, 152,000 of them had been van drivers and lorry drivers.
White van man became khaki van man.
The white van man, right? Exactly. You know, 79,000 of them had been grocers' assistants, which says something about, you know, they'd sort of worked in Alfred Roberts's, you know, grocery shop in the north of England. 51,000 of them had been painters and decorators, and you know, there's tons of these kind of statistics. You know, there are novelists and journalists and poets and all kinds of, you know, rather motley people who sort of show up. But I think what the one thing that combined, I say, unites them all is the idea that none of them ever expected to do this. None of them particularly want to do this. And none of them really have much of a sense about what they're going to encounter when they become soldiers, other than the fact that it doesn't sound that great, and they're all pretty much convinced that they're going to get killed in some, you know, slaughterhouse in France, and if they're not going to get killed, they're going to be subject to endless spit and polish and bullshit, you know, in the barracks, and endlessly blancoing equipment and so on.
Ian Carr is asking, do we know if recruits were healthier and fitter than their fathers had been in
Absolutely.
1914?
Yes. One of the things which, this is a kind of story unto itself, but, one of the reasons why the experience of military service in World War II is different to World War I is because Britain's a different country by 1939 than it had been in 1914. We talk about the post-World War II years, the late 40s and the 50s as being the great period of the welfare state and this kind of breakthrough in kind of, sort of the social services and so on. But in many ways, that had actually happened in the 20s and 30s. The conservative governments of that period don't actually get as much credit as they deserve for a lot of the improvement in both in the standard of life and the quality of life for ordinary people. If you grow up in 1930s Britain as an ordinary working class person, obviously, there are still lots of pockets of poverty and so on, and we know about those. But on the whole, if you grow up in 1930s Britain, you grow up in a country which is wealthier than it's ever been before, and in which you enjoy a better standard of living than you've ever done before, and certainly much more than your father had done. And that's actually reflected in terms of soldiers in 1939 way more than men in 1914 had done. They are taller than their fathers had been, and these are a reflection of better medical care, better nutrition. Ironically, in some ways, it's a problem for the army, because one of the things which had characterized the army of 1914 is that these were young men who were used to a pretty austere kind of life. That life in if you were a coal miner or an industrial worker in Edwardian Britain, life was pretty tough. You were used to a fairly demanding kind of existence. And that wasn't quite so true by the 1930s. You're now in an age in which you've got the emergence of a consumer society in which young people are much more used to a higher standard of living, and to suddenly be stuck in a barracks at Larkhill or wherever you are, Longmoor, or wherever you end up, and have to eat potatoes and cabbage soup and spend the whole day again blancoing your kit or polishing your boots. This is not a life that people are used to, and constantly being barked at by sergeants throughout the day, and sort of screamed at on the for having their hands in their pockets and so on as they cross the field. This is not the world of civilian life in the 1930s, and it's one that both soldiers push back at. Yeah, vaccinations, that's also true. Yeah, and also that the army has to try and figure out what to do about. The fact that they've got a different kind of soldier now, and they've got to.
That's the point, isn't it? I mean, when people who watched Peter Jackson's First World War documentary and the audio archives, all those soldiers going off in 1914, they were entering the army to get better food. They were entering to get better clothes, better boots.
Right.
As you said there, the 1920s and 30s, despite the fact there'd been the Depression, people were able to buy bananas in Newcastle. And there's that famous song of "Yes, we have no bananas" from the rationing in World War II. People hadn't had bananas for that many generations, if only one, before World War II. But like everything else, you get used to your creature comforts very quickly. And as James Holland makes the point, in 1938, Britain was importing 80% of a lot of its foodstuffs, and I was expecting pineapples and exotic delicacies from around the world, which is part of the problem when that is then cut off, those supplies, and then training an army of civilians who had used to that type of dietary requirement. The country has been used to having this prosperous, and then suddenly it's got to fight a war on multiple fronts. It was a difficult prospect.
It's fascinating that even like the number of young men who had actually had their own bedroom in growing up in the 1930s is much, much higher than it had been in the Edwardian period. And if you just think about that, the idea of switching to a life in barracks or dormitories where you have no privacy, where you have no some of these essential kind of most intimate aspects of your life, that's quite a shock. I'll just say one other thing before we move on about this, is that the other characteristic about the army is that it is a disproportionately lower middle class. Which in some ways might be a bit of a surprise, because you might sort of assume that that soldiers are going to be all sort of industrial workers and so on. But of course, it's precisely the industrial workers, the factory workers, the miners and so on, who are exempted from military service because they need to, these, if you're a skilled engineer in a car factory in Coventry or something like that, you're not going to be called up because they need you to build Whitley bombers, or radios or whatever it might be, and so instead it's the people, it's the van drivers and the grocer's assistants and people like that, people who had actually had a pretty decent standard of living in the 1930s, but their jobs were not essential to the war effort, and so these were the most expendable people, the ones who could be shunted into the army. And so I think the culture clash is all the more greater of the fact that you've got people who come from lower middle class backgrounds, relatively privileged backgrounds, who suddenly find themselves being private blogs, in some godforsaken place in the Orkney Islands or wherever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the revelations that your book kind of reminded me of, because it wasn't the revelation because I realized I did know that, or I should have known it. As you said, it is lower middle class, because you're talking about my grandfather. My grandfather's father had been a farm labourer, but my grandfather, who was called up in September 1940, was a farm manager. So he was in an office. So it wasn't in a job where it was that was reserved. So he was straight up. Whereas his friends who were actual farmers didn't have to go. So
right.
So I think we have an idea from the war film of it being the tough Geordie steel workers and of course there are some of them, but it is.
But on the whole, they're doing other things. They're doing things which are appropriate. Causes a good deal of conflict. I mean, in terms tension on about the idea that the lower middle class feel that they're the poor buggers who are being sent off to actually fight and die, where the lucky factory workers are sort of staying at home, working, building Sterlings and Lancasters and so on, and making extremely good money, much more better money than much better pay than a private soldier's earning. This has sort of political implications later on.
Well, we just had that question from Norma about did their experience, and we're skipping ahead a bit in the second war, have an impact on the men's political leanings. And absolutely, I mean, we could talk about the rabbit hole of all the educational pamphlets that were sent to the British Army and services around the world that had ideas of self-improvement and what you can do, and courses available. It sets people thinking about the possibilities of getting away from whatever job they've been in and doing something better, quote unquote. But
one of my favorite quotes from that I read from the Imperial War Museum, a memoir there, is a guy who said, I'm just paraphrasing, but he said, when I joined the army in 1940, I was a tight-arsed little middle-class Tory, and by the time the war ended in 1945, I wanted to vote communist. And that experience, I think, is quite common. Now, I don't think that means, of course, that the army turned everybody communist, but I think what it did do is, my own view about sort of the 1945 election, which I'm thinking a lot about these days because I've got to write a book about it, is I think a lot of the reason why people voted for Labour in 1945 isn't particularly because they had become socialists or they had been won over by particular policy choices or anything like that. I think they were just pissed off. I think they were pissed off, and what they wanted to vote against was the sergeant major. They wanted to vote against the establishment. They wanted to vote against them, and they were represented by everybody in authority, which meant Winston Churchill. It meant the Tory, or perceived as Tory, officers. There was a huge burst of kind of, for 5 years we've put up with this. We've put up with being barked at, shouted at, and marched up and down. And this is finally our chance where we get to give it to them. Give it to them again. And I think even some of the officers feel that way too. That they're sick of it as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why you get such a radical shift in 1945, but also why it doesn't last very long. Once people have kind of got that out of their system and they've gotten back to civilian life.
The student years. They're
all radicals, for that brief period, and then they settle down again and they all become tight-ass little Tories again.
That's a depressing thought. But let's move on to point number 5, which is there's this massive great conscription. The army is starting to modernize. Everything's being produced. The equipment that was trialed in 1940s now being ironed out and made better. And yet, in the middle of the war, there is this real morale problem. So,
well, I mean, part of it, of course, is just the fact that from 1941 and certainly the first half of 1942 are not particularly good years for the British Army. You struggle to find a military engagement or a campaign in which it actually accomplishes anything other than embarrassing defeat. I mean, you've got everything from the campaigns in Greece and Crete, North Africa, which is mostly a story of with the one exception of course the Operation Compass and the defeat of the Italians. But so you've got that glorious moment, but then most of 1941 and this first half of 1942 is being kicked around by Rommel. And then you've got the experience, of course, in East and Southeast Asia, and the humiliating defeat, of the armies in Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and so on. So you've got a story of constant defeat, and by the beginning of 1942, the newspapers are all starting to say, well, look, it was one thing for people to say back in 1940, well, we weren't ready for war. We didn't have the kit, we didn't have the training and so on. But the war's been going on for 2 years now, and we're still having our asses kicked constantly. What is the explanation at this point? So there's a lot. So the army's external kind of prestige is rather at a low point, in comparison, of course, to the other services, which by contrast appear to be doing very well. So the RAF has fought the Battle of Britain. It's flying its bombing missions against Germany. Seems to be doing definitely taking the fight to the enemy. The Royal Navy, although it's suffered defeats, is also it's winning the battle, or it seems to be fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. So it's doing well. Most of the British Army, of course, in 1942 is at home. It's sitting in the UK. It's been there ever since 1940. It's been guarding against an invasion that never came. And now it's waiting for, expeditionary forces, which may at some point be sent to either to the Mediterranean or to the Northwest Europe. And so internally, the experience of being a soldier for most British soldiers in 1942 is sitting around in a depot or in a barracks somewhere in the UK, having to do, peeling spuds, drilling, blancoing your kit, and feeling like this is a complete waste of time. That you are contributing nothing to the war effort. Your families, if you live in, if they live in London or Liverpool or somewhere like that, are being bombed, and you're having to write. The irony is the terrific irony is that rather than in the First World War of all the civilians back in Britain, writing to the Tommies on the Western Front, hoping everybody's okay. Instead, it's the soldiers who are all stuck in the countryside somewhere, miles and miles away from all the bombing, who are writing to their families saying, are you, is everything all right? They're the ones who seem to be in the front line. And as I've got this quote. Frank Owen was a liberal journalist who later becomes the editor of SEAC, which is the army newspaper in Southeast Asia. But he writes much at this time about how ordinary soldiers are just sick of this. They were called up. They're okay about doing their bit. They're willing to do it, but they feel like the army is indifferent to them. It serves no particular purpose. And you get this in the morale reports too at the time. The army's internal morale reports talk constantly about the fact that everybody seems to be dissatisfied. They're not really pleased about their officers, and they feel that their military service is almost an embarrassment to them. That there's nothing to be done. So if we go to the next,
and that's the thing that people like yourself and Jonathan Fennell write about is those morale reports. Is because Richard Fisher's making the very good point that by 1942, doctrinally, the things are improving. The equipment is being ironed out, but the men using it have not had a chance to use it in anger yet. So that, as you say, they're the ones sitting around going, "Why are we not doing anything? We want to. We're here to do our bit, but we can't do our bit yet." Yeah. So people who focus on the improving technology of the British Army, there's the paradox of 42 being the equipment that was going to win the war is pretty much now introduced now. The models of weapon, the models of artillery, even the tank designs are more or less kind of sorted by 1942. And yet the army itself was in a weird situation, which is,
well, the paradox of the war in many ways is that, you know, by 1942, Britain's almost certainly going to win the war. You know, for grand structural, you know, economic, strategic reasons, that, you know, it's perfectly fair to point that out. It's probably not going to lose the war, but it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like that in 1942, and I do think it's important to sort of, I mean, much as I admire, you know, a book like David Edgerton's book on Britain, which I think is a magnificent revisionist work, which kind of corrects an awful lot of myths. I think the one thing it does leave out is kind of the psychological element to it all, which is that people really were concerned that, you know, the country didn't really have what it took to be able to bring this thing to a conclusion. At the end of the day, you know, for all of the, you know, economic advantages that the country had, or its improving equipment and weapons and so on, first of all, you didn't see much practical experience of this. You know, it seemed like for all of, you know, the tanks still seemed to be getting knocked out with depressing regularity in North Africa. And also, you know, you were still going to have to do, ultimately, you were going to have to march on Berlin. You know, at least that was the way it was perceived. You were going to bring this thing to an end. You were going to have to send an army to Berlin. And could you really rely on this, you know, very discontented army of civilians to be able to do that? After all, the Germans are pretty hard to beat, you know, and the experience of 1940 had shown that, you know, that hadn't changed at all. So anyway, you know, I brought, you know, much of what I talk about in Ronald Adam in the book, and I think he's someone who's sort of been rediscovered a bit in the last few years. I'm very pleased that that's been the case. You know, Ronald Adam is the adjutant general during the war. So he is, in some ways, he is kind of Alan Brooks' right-hand man. He's he's on the Army Council. They're personal friends, and the adjutant general is responsible for all of the kind of issues relating to morale, welfare, manpower distribution, and so on in the army. And Adam is really old school in lots of ways. I mean, he's an old Etonian. He's a minor member of the aristocracy. You know, he is very much part of this old kind of model of what an officer should be. But I think one of the things that's remarkable about him is that he has a very modern mind, and I think he's very open-minded. And I think that unlike some of the kind of blimpish officers who were his contemporaries, who tended to say, well, you know, the problem with this army is just that it's not tough enough. And, you know, this generation is not tough enough. And what we need to do is we need to double down on the spit and polish. We need to double down on the discipline and turn them into the kind of men that their fathers were. And Adam really said, look, this is futile. You know, we whatever we think about the youth of today, they are what they are, and we're not going to be able to change them. And so if we are going to try and turn this into an army that works, we have to meet them halfway. In some ways, we cannot simply continue to pretend that this is a peacetime army that's made up of, you know, volunteers who, you know, quote unquote, who come from the very lowest reaches of the working class. These are young men who are better educated, who are expected, you know, that ask questions that regulars didn't tend to ask, that have expectations that pre-war regulars didn't have. And so, you know, one of the things that Adam tries to do over the next few years, and from certainly 1941, 1942, until the end of the war, is to try and introduce some institutional reforms in the army. So, I mean, you know, he transforms officer selection, for instance. So he makes it much easier for men of relatively humble socioeconomic backgrounds to become officers, which there'd been enormous handicaps to this in the early stages of the war, where, you know, if you were a potential officer recruit, you know, they would stick you in front of a selection board and kind of ask, you know, where do your parents hunt and that kind of thing, you know. And so he tries to get rid of so much of that stuff. And he has a fair degree of success in that. You know, this is what you get by the end of the war are the Edward Heaths kind of officers, you know, but grammar school boys, you know, who tend to be, you know, who certainly are not working class on the whole, but also hadn't been to private school. They were not aristocrats.
We just had a couple of comments, Alan, about the distinction in 42, particularly about UK-based army, the army that's training up for the ETO and the army overseas. Because I mean, a couple of comments that we've had in. Ernest Manny saying it doesn't look like that in the Far East because of the morale and they're doing nothing and blanking because they're in the thick of it. And Ian Carr made the comment, I kind of find it now, that if troops had been to North Africa in 1942, they didn't survive. They didn't come back till 45. So do you think there's and they had the question about colonial troops as well, all the Indian and Australian, because most of those didn't pass through the UK. Most of those were trained overseas and served overseas, India being a big base for it. So do you think there's a big difference between those that pass through the Blighty proper and those that pass through the British Army overseas?
What you have in World War II really is not one British army, but several. I mean, you've got several British armies that have completely different experiences. If you're a member of the, if you're in the the Western Desert Force in 1940 and you're in Egypt, you're probably never, probably not going to go back to Britain, for the whole of the war. If you're going to have a completely different kind of experience. If you go out early into whether it's the Middle East or Southeast Asia, you're going to have a completely different kind of experience from the men who eventually would form the British Liberation Army, as I always think of it from the documents, Second Army, 21st Army Group. Most British soldiers spend most of the war in the UK. Most British soldiers, if they engage in combat at all, which most of them don't, will do so for only a comparatively short period of time.
And this brings us to point number 7. And this is the idea: is so much of what we read and understand about World War II are those regulars that served, people like Keith Douglas, the poet who does North Africa, then Normandy, and George MacDonald Fraser, who's out in the Far East. And you don't get we didn't get Boy's Own best-selling books in the 50s and 60s that were about
being in the Royal Army Service Corps, and
who spent 2 years driving trucks around the UK.
But actually, that's the characteristic experience. The experience that if you're going to talk about a typical experience of the British soldier in the Second World War, it's about spending most of the war in the UK driving a lorry around.
You're talking about my grandfather again. My grandfather was in the Royal Artillery in anti-aircraft and searchlights, and although he did his job and he was mostly a clerk, he could type. He was a retired gunnery sergeant. The only time one of his camps was ever attacked by the Germans, he was in the toilet having a shit and missed it. So he did 6 years in the Royal Artillery anti-aircraft, but only one experience of actually seeing enemy aircraft, but he actually missed it. So and he joked about that, but that's an example of someone who did something for 6 years but never ever saw an enemy soldier.
And of course, in some ways, what this is a reflection of is the success of the army, because John Buckley's talked about, with Monty's men and so on. This is by 1943, 1944, it's a tremendously modern army. And being a modern army means that the tail of the army has grown disproportionately to the teeth. So, if you want to have a mechanized army, if you want to have trucks and tanks, then you've got to have somebody to service them, and you've got to have people who are driving the tankers with the petrol in them to keep them going. I mean, this is always a tremendous bone of contention between Churchill and Alanbrooke, because Churchill is always looking at, say we have 200,000 men in the Middle East, and only 30 or 40,000 of them are actually engaged against the enemy, and this is preposterous. What are all of these men doing? And Alanbrooke is having to explain to him, with increasing impatience about, look, if you want to have an army that is, that operates with modern equipment, most of the soldiers are going to be dealing with that equipment. That's the only way you can do it. Otherwise, the whole thing's going to grind to a halt. So it makes eminent sense, and it has a lot to do. If you want to understand, obviously, the success of the army finally in 1944 and 45, you have to look at the tail and these forms of supply and support. But of course, it's one thing to say that; it's another thing to actually have experienced it. And I think the army is internally divided in lots of ways in terms of experience and in terms of attitude. So the infantry, of course, who are by far the worst experience in the war is to be in a regular line infantry battalion. these are the lads who are lowest paid, tend to receive the kind of, the least prestige, it's by far the most dangerous job of all. And yet, they are surrounded by a force of, B echelon or, a line of communications troops. Now, they need them. They need, Remy and the RASC and the RAOC and all of these things. But it's tremendously galling to think that, all of these blokes behind the lines are, never or very, very rarely encounter any serious danger. And that's the nature
specializing of roles, isn't it? I mean, in the First World War, there weren't paratroopers and commandos and the equivalents of LRD. Well, people will argue and say there are some sort of things, but World War II is a proliferation of those kind of people who are doing the really exciting, daring do stuff. And then at the other end, there's the people who, as you say, just repairing trucks and making airfields. And that middle part of those who are in the British infantry is different to similar to the First World War experience, but a smaller number of people, a smaller percentage, I should say.
Yeah, and there's an enormous amount of resentment about it. One of the things that always makes me chuckle is that when the campaign medals are distributed, and they're announced sort of towards the end of the war, so things like the Burma Star and the Africa Star, the infantry get furious about this. Because they say, why is it that, if you've been in a line infantry battalion in the desert fighting Rommel, why is it that I get the same campaign decoration as somebody who's been sitting in Cairo, working in a motor pool there, and there's never, the closest they got to, fighting Rommel was reading about it in the newspaper. They talk about the Burma Star as being the Chowringhee medal because it's not you basically sat in Calcutta the entire war and you received this. I think that's underappreciated now, because we tend to sort of lump all servicemen together as having, assuming that they were all, they were all carrying it. They were all wearing a Brodie helmet and carrying a Lee Enfield and sort of out in the field, where of course that actually is a minority experience during the war. Most people don't come anywhere close to it. Even the Royal Artillery, which is a hugely important teeth arm. But if you're an artillerist, on the whole, you're not regularly exposed to combat. You have a life which is infinitely less awful than being in the infantry.
So we know that we covered them. A lot of men, most of the men, don't actually see the sharp end, and yet by night, then to get to point number 8. Because of finding all these people to repair trucks and build airfields and drive trucks and do all this modernized specialist roles that have been required, there is a massive, great manpower shortage. And David O'Keefe wanted me to ask earlier about the morale surge hits in 42, or a drop in 44 as well. You talked about the one in 42, but there's the one in the winter of 44. We'll touch on that with Mary Louise.
Well, the thing about 44, of course, is this is for the first time really since 1940. A significant chunk of the army is now actually engaged against the enemy. In these really closing months of the war. And what I think has happened actually is that the army is not only modern, it's almost too modern. It's actually overdone it. Because there had been this, one of the quote unquote lessons learned of 1940 was that the Germans had won because they had tanks and tanks and tanks and panzers and panzers and panzers. And so, there is this obsession with converting infantry battalions into armored units. The Guards even get involved, of course, and create the Guards Armored Division, by 1944. And actually what happens, I think, by the midpoint of 1944 is they realize they've overdone it. And they are actually short of infantry. They just don't have enough, because these battles are not blitzkriegs which are over in a matter of weeks. These are these grinding attritional battles which much more resemble First World War battles than what had happened in 1940. And yes, tanks are valuable, tanks are important, but you most of all what you need is the PBI, who can actually occupy ground. And so this is why you have this, Montgomery, of course, has to start disbanding divisions in the autumn of 1944, because he has to break up 50th Division and 59th Division, because he just doesn't have any men left. It's quite clear that, Britain is tapped out in terms of manpower at this point, having to, fight an industrial war involved with a large air force and a large navy and a large army. Something has to give. And you just, by this point, it's been made clear to the army there are no more troops. That you will fight and finish the war with what you have, and so you have to actually start disbanding infantry units just in order to try and keep up a replacement rate. And you've got the infinitely horrible experience of fighting in Italy in the winter of South. I think of all the miserable experiences in the war, and there were many. I mean, being in a line infantry company in the Italian mountains in the winter of 1944-45 sounds like a pretty miserable time, because quite apart from just how awful it is, you also get the feeling that it's not really contributing anything either. It's not even as if you can console yourself with the idea that this is how we're going to win the war, because that's all happening in France anyway by this point. This is clearly a kind of forgotten theater. And this, I think, has a great deal to do with the enormous desertion rate during the period.
I mean, and that's something that we'll be discussing with my guests later on. And I think that winter 44 period we've talked about it in World War II TV previously, is the period that everybody skips over in the narrative. It goes straight from Normandy to VE Day, and Peter Caddick Adams was almost worried about his Victory in the West book being a bit overlooked, because what do you mean? What were you doing? Surely after the Battle of Bulge, it was just biding everyone's time until VE Day.
Well, everybody in September, at the beginning of September 1944, everyone thinks the war's about to end. They think the war will be over in a couple of weeks. And when Market Garden begins, of course, that's the assumption. This is it. This is the climactic battle of the war. The government is already preparing to start demobilization at the end of 1944 because they think the war in Europe is going to be over, and it isn't over, of course, as we know. And it must be a really depressing experience, to sort of think that we've got to continue this into next year, and for who knows, maybe even into 1946. I mean, if the things actually seem to be slowing down, we could be continuing this for years. It is no wonder at this point. I think you would have to have a heart of stone not to think that for some poor sod who's out on the Gothic line in the winter of 1944, who's like, I have done my bit, and I have frankly had enough.
I mean, I was reading about the men of the 49th Division on the island in October and November out in the Netherlands, when it was just wet everywhere, and thankfully the British didn't end up with the trench foot problem that the US did, and we're covering that later in the second show later. But that winter of 44 was pretty miserable, even though the historian in me tells me we're winning the war now. The end is in sight. The finishing post is just over there now, and yet you've got to get over that hump and that physical and mental hurdle of as people often talk about, one of the worst weather winters of the 20th century. And just when everyone's weary, you've got to make that final surge of effort to get over that hump, get over that winter and that psychological issue to bring down Germany and defeat Hitler, and we can all go home.
And in a paradoxical way, the fact that the outcome of the eventual outcome of the war isn't really in doubt actually makes it worse, because at least in 1940 you could think, I've got to fight to save my country. I mean, this is the stakes could not be higher. By the winter of 1944, it's obvious where this is going to end up. I mean, the Germans are going to lose in the end. It's just they're going to make it as unpleasant and miserable and protracted an experience as they can possibly be. And who, in their right mind, everybody kind of has their demob notice somewhere sort of vaguely in the front of their minds. They're thinking about the end of the war. They're thinking about what their lives will be like at the end of the war. Who really wants to risk their life at this point? Whether you're in some polder in southern Holland or out in the Apennine Mountains or something like that. Who wants to pointlessly risk their life anymore for a war, the outcome of which is already predetermined anyway?
And wherever you are, even if you're in the remote part of Italy, you're in a bit far, you now can see the arsenal of democracy. You now can see where you used to see 3 or 4 aircraft flying overhead. Now you'd see dozens and dozens, or potentially hundreds. If you did go back to rear bases, you would see these huge amounts of ships and trucks and guns and things like that. And yet, when you go back to the front line, there you are in the American cartoon, Willie and Joe sitting in your muddy, water-filled foxhole, thinking, "Hang on, how is that air power? How is that big war helping me in my foxhole?"
And when it came to desertion, I mean, Alexander had said back, reported back to the War Office and said, look, there is only one way in which we can really make a big, we can really decrease the desertion rate, and that's by reintroducing the death penalty. And even as he says this, and even as it goes, they already know that it's not going to happen. There are, political obstacles to that, which just make it absolutely impossible. So, they basically resign themselves to the fact, for an ordinary infantryman in, Italy or whatever, the idea of spending, a couple of years in the glass house seems infinitely preferable to being, killed out in the Apennines. And so short of threatening them with hanging, which is not going to happen, there is not a hell of a lot we can do, and we just have to accept that this is just one of this. We have to bake this in, into our assumptions.
And this is the idea, again, going back to the stereotypical image of the British Tommy, that they're always chirpy and cheeky and breaking into singing, Siegfried line, is not always the case. The British Army was grumbling all the time. They were wishing someone else was doing it. They were wishing they were home, and if they could find a reason to get out the front line, a lot of them would.
Yeah, quite rationally,
as I would.
Yeah, as everybody who in their right mind would want to continue to do this.
Yeah.
All right, let's
move on to number 9, which is
okay.
And I love this one, that because I don't think in 580 something I've only used the word forgotten, I think, in 2 or 3 titles, and it was based on my author's choice of book titles themselves. But this is a classic because every army is a forgotten one, isn't it?
Yeah, every army, all of these armies were obsessed with the way in which they were being perceived at home, the amount of, they were, Alan Bennett said they were like, actors because they loved to read the reviews. They wanted to review, see what's the Daily Mail saying about us, or Daily Herald, or whatever it might be. And there is this constant sense, chip on their shoulder, no matter where you are, that your experiences are being marginalized, that no one is paying sufficient attention. So of course, famously, of course, the 14th Army is the forgotten army, but the army in Italy feels itself
D-Day Dodgers,
feels itself to be forgotten. The army in the first army had felt itself to be ignored in comparison with 8th Army in the experience in North Africa. The BLA complains, that they feel that they're not getting the credit that they deserve. And then, of course, there's the armies tucked away in so what have become backwaters of the war, like the army, very considerable sized army that's in Iran and in the Middle East by 1944. Long after all of the drama and the glamour has kind of moved on. They have been there for years, and they're sick of it. They feel like nobody pays any attention. This becomes, there are huge debates that take place about the demobilization process and the repatriation process at the end of the war. People have been away for 5-6 years in some cases, away from home. They've lost, they're worried about their family relationships. They're worried about their wives. They are sick of being in the army. I think that's, the one thing about, however nostalgic people would subsequently get. Greece, yeah, right. There's a major, of course, in the Civil War. No matter how nostalgic people would subsequently become as they got older, middle age, people would look back fondly about, back with the boys in the army. Everybody in 1945 is absolutely sick of it. They all want to go home. Nobody wants to be a career soldier. Nobody wants to spend time in occupation armies or in the, they know that there are, the armies are still going to be in Germany and Italy and so on for months, possibly years afterwards. They know that all of the spit and polish and bullshit is going to be infinitely worse, at the end of this. And so, everybody feels marginalized. They feel forgotten, and they feel like, they want to go home. I think that's one of the difficulties with working with different kinds of sources. When we oral history, particularly oral histories that were done many years after events. So the kind of oral histories that were done in the 1980s and 1990s, they are valuable without doubt. But I think one of the difficulties, or one of the reasons you have to be cautious with them, is, of course, these are old men reflecting on their youth. when, you know, they have gone through many decades of kind of, you know, increasingly rose-tinted nostalgia about you know, what it had been like. And so it's much more common for people talking about their wartime experiences in the 1980s or the 1990s to say, oh, you know, we had a good time, really. And, you know, I sort of, you know, I miss it, and I missed the camaraderie and being with the lads and everything. You know, nobody in 1945 was saying that. You know, I'm sick to death of the lads. I'm sick to death of being.
Yeah, I mean, again, you're talking about my granddad. My granddad said, because when I was like 10 and 11, getting interested in World War II, I'd ask him about, you know, did you get a chance to meet American soldiers and, you know, people around the world and stuff? And because you had to make trips to London. I said, yeah, so all we ever did is grumble. We go to pubs and we just grumble. They grumble, we grumble. We all wanted to be home. And years later, it became the most exciting chapter of his life. He loved talking about it, and I still use his British Army boot brushes to polish my boots. But at the same time, I could see this change in his affection for that era over the years, and it's understandable.
Memory is a dynamic thing, you know. It changes. You know, we middle age. Speaking as a middle-aged man, I can say, you know, middle age is profoundly disappointing in lots of ways. You know, you get, you know, grumpy and your back aches and so on, and you kind of reflect upon the, you know, your life, and you get nostalgic about your youth. And what could, you know, what experience could you not get more nostalgic about, you know, than one in which it would have been, you know, possibly had been at the time might have been boring or frustrating, but increasingly is one that seems to have been exciting and you know,
and especially as well. But we're going back to movies and comics. Is by the 70s and 80s, the general public are being fed the positivity of the heroes going over and winning the war and defeating Hitler and defeating Rommel in North Africa and defeating those dastardly Japanese in the jungles. And so granddad or dad or uncle would now suddenly want to tell the stories because child, and I'm talking about myself now, child reading comic in 1976 or 77 were you in the army, would want to get that understanding, and that they would then get excited telling you. But we'll move on to the final point to wrap things up, which is, despite this tricky start in 1940, despite the morale issue in 42 and the other slump in 44, the army did do pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm not really an operational historian. You know, I leave that to the hands of people who are much more qualified to do that than I am. But I mean, I think, you know, you can broadly say, you know, that the army, you know, the British Army does pretty well in the. I mean, they do win the war, you know, and it is not simply a case, as sometimes, you know, is suggested, well, it was just, you know, sheer mass of material, or it was just sort of overwhelming numbers or anything like that. At the end of the day, you know, infantrymen still have to cross that 100 yards of you know, contested ground. You still have to occupy that territory. You've still got to defeat, you know, what was in many ways the most formidable, you know, armies in the world. The army adapts pretty well on the whole, you know, to the challenges of war, and emerges both having won and also won with a relatively small loss of life, which is, of course, always at the, you know, one of the main goals, you know, is to emerge from this without the kind of slaughters that have been seen in World War II. But I think there's always this, and you know, and this so much guides the way in which the army is deployed and thought about during the war. There is always this sense that it's not made up of the same men that had been, you know, that had fought the war from 1914 to 1918. And this is a kind of this is something that people obviously don't say out loud a great deal, at least not in public. But often, if you look at private comments that are made by everybody from Churchill downwards, you know, I mean, one of, you know, Churchill's comments about the army throughout the war in his private comments are, you know, continuously ones of, they're just not as tough as they were before. You know, the armies that fought on the Somme were willing to fight to the death. That, you know, these young men today just don't have the same stuff that their you know, fathers did. And you know, Brooke will make similar kinds of comments, you know, saying that, you know, like civilian life in the 20s and 30s just became too soft. We don't have the same kind of attitude that we did before. All of the best men died in World War I, and so, you know, what was left was a sort of slightly eugenic kind of argument to all of this, and it coloured so much of the way in which the army was, you want to understand one of the reasons why Churchill was reluctant about a second front in the war. There are many reasons for that, but there was always this undercurrent of they're just not really good enough. At the end of it, they're going to blow it. They're going to make a mess of it. And we're either going to be humiliatingly defeated, or worse, there's going to be a massive slaughter. And that they never really completely free themselves of that. So it's the irony is that the people who were most critical of the army in the war were actually its own leaders. Both in the political realm and in the civilian realm. If you want to understand something about the experience of the army, you have to start off with that point. Did much better really than it was expected to.
To the point, and we'll wrap things up, is where now it's revered, and that's that you hinted the fact that the in 45 there was this idea that the Second World War army hadn't been as good as the First World War army, but then by the 50s, national service people who had served in Aden and Malaya didn't consider themselves as worthy as those who'd been in World War II. And then in the Falklands, people who hadn't been in Malaya and Aden and Cyprus didn't think that. And then now it says that's just a cyclic thing. My friends who are modern servicemen who are retired find that the British Legion clubs in the UK are not always prospering because of the World War II reputation being held in such a high regard that if you did 7 years, 5-6 years in the 1970s in the Cold War, you did nothing like proper soldiering. So that the British Legion isn't the place for you.
Well, I always say I'm sure that if you look at the records from ancient Greece, that there were the hoplites were complaining that the lads that they have nowadays to fight the Persians just don't have the same stuff as as we used to. This is just something that constantly goes on.
Well, it's that in the internal conversation about the fact that we look to the generation below us, their music, and think it's crap, and then they look at the generation that they think it's crap, and then people then go back and find their grandparents' music, and it's this sort of circle of life thing about dismissing stuff and then appreciating it. And but the British Army, I think, as I said, and the sidebar has agreed with me, is people like yourself and Jonathan Fennell and Daniel Tolman, and to some extent, you're looking at these ideas about the British soldier or the British figure, because obviously Britain at bay and what have you, talk about the wider world and Royal Navy and Royal Air Force and the civilians as well. But it is ripe for re-examination, I think.
Yeah, right. Particularly this sense that that were somehow people were different and better in the past than they were before. So we have all of this kind of this stuff about people were more willing to put up with austerity in the in the 40s than they were before. People were more civilians were more prepared to put up with bombing and other kind and with somehow that we've lost some kind of spiritual quality, that kind of existed in the past. But the point is that back in the 1940s, everyone was saying that too. That this generation isn't what they where they were in Edward VII's time or whatever it might be. The one constant in all of this is this assumption that the people who lived 25 years or 50 years before us were better than we are. And it is useful as a corrective, I think, to be reminded of that. Everybody, yes, we live in an age now which is infinitely more comfortable in lots of ways, than that of the 1940s. We have advantages that people then couldn't have dreamed of. But people in the 1940s had lots of advantages that their predecessors had not had, and the same will no doubt be true, of the people that succeed us. There's nothing new about this, and to sort of try and draw, generalizations about it is to miss the point, which is that we're always obsessed with the fact that we're not as good as the people that came before us were.
Yeah, and definitely just the final point is that culling the archives for these amazing accounts of people, submarine commanders dealing with, action every day in Malta, and the commandos who did 17 different raids in World War II. That's all very important for understanding what the war was all about. But there are also these people, as we said, who just did 5 or 6 years doing a very essential part of a very important job, but they were a tiny, tiny cog on a wheel of keeping this mechanized army going. But those stories don't always see the light of day.
Well, I mean, the thing, the predominant experience, if you were British and you lived through World War II, the predominant experience was probably boredom. You probably, more than anything else, you found the war boring. You found the boring and inconvenient and tedious. It created lots of petty restrictions on your life.
Well, this is the weird thing, because we're in the era of my channel and the We Have Ways channel where war is cool, and I use that in inverted because you can go and get and talk. And see people with tanks and the Monty's men turn up there in their battle dress, and it's fantastic for them because they can explain to the public what they're doing, but they're only wearing it for a few weekends a year, whereas some people had to wear it every single day for 6 years, and it's itchy and uncomfortable. And the idea of looking back at the war with rose-colored spectacles is something that we need, that enthusiasm for the past to fuel the writing of history, that we need to keep it restrained and understand it wasn't always a good experience or a positive experience for those who went through it.
Yeah, and just again, kind of tedious experience. This is the thing, most of all, being in the British Army in World War II, for most of the time, for most people, was probably just really kind of tiresome. People just didn't really want to do it. Most of the time they weren't really exposed to any great danger, but they were not exposed to any great excitement either. It was something that you got through, and at the end of it, you kind of wanted to forget about it. My sort of last comment will be, one of the things that fascinates me is the way, if you look at the story of the early anniversaries of the war. So if you look at, say the fifth anniversary of D-Day, or the 10th anniversary of D-Day, no one was really that interested, because they wanted to move on with their lives. It was something they had done, and they wanted to just get on with life, and everybody had done it. So I mean, what was why make such a big fuss about it anyway? It's only really once you get to the 1980s, when numbers are thinning out, that you start to suddenly see an interest. The number of veterans is obviously smaller by that point, and also there's a sufficiently big detachment now in time between the experience of the past and the present. But no one cared in 1954 about June the 6th. It was like, that was just, let's move on. Let's move on with our lives. There's the great Hancock show, where some of you may possibly have seen, about the reunion, where he gets to a reunion with 4 of his wartime mates, and the whole thing is first of all, it's obvious that they've just completely romanticized what it was actually like, which was terrible. And they've got nothing in common when they get together again. They've all gone off with their lives and done different things, and the whole experience is sort of profoundly depressing for him, because he realizes that all of this nostalgia that he's built up is just totally in his head.
Brilliant. Well, that's an excellent way to end things. So, Bryn, as always, it's been great chatting to you. We'll have you back on in the future. And how is the new book work coming along?
Slow but sure. That's the way I'll say it. We're getting there. We're getting there.
Good. Well, we'll look forward to speaking to you about that. But there we are then. It's another show ended. So I'll be back in an hour and 45 minutes, folks. So with Mary Louise Roberts. So I will see you all then. In the meantime, thank you very much, Alan Allport, for joining me. And thank you very much for watching. Cheers, everybody. Bye.